Good afternoon. Welcome to our afternoon session at Constellations. I'm so excited to introduce our next two presenters who are going to be in conversation on the racial justice aspects of drug policy, including the coloniality and the history of the war on drugs, how it intersects with race. Really pleased to introduce you to Dr. Kojo Koram, who teaches at the School of Law at Birkbeck, University of London, recipient of too many awards to list, trustee of Harm Reduction International, very importantly, and author of my favorite book of 2019, The War on Drugs and the Global Color Line. Kojo will be speaking to Ash Sarkar, who is an incredibly well-known name, barely worthy of a long bio and introduction. Ash is a senior editor at Novara Media and teaches at the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. Kojo and Ash, we're so pleased to have you here this afternoon at Constellations.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing us, Naomi, and thank you to everyone who's taken time to join us today to have this conversation around all these different elements of drug policy, from the racial justice aspect to questions around pleasure and engagement to questions around hedonism. I think we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I've got a fantastic co-conversationalist to cover them with. Thank you for taking the time to join us, Ash.
I mean, I love talking to you about this stuff, Kojo, whether it is here at an event or at the pub.
Exactly.
Always find ourselves talking about the same stuff, which is why prohibitionism has failed and why something perhaps more pleasurable and more humane might be better.
Absolutely. And that is an interesting place to start off, thinking about the failures of prohibition and the current movement towards driving towards drug policy reform. It's really interesting to be talking to you about it, because I don't think anyone could disagree that you really established yourself as one of the leading voices in the British left over the past few years. And when we actually look at the British left, when we look at the institutional left, we might think about the trade unions, we might think about the Labour Party, even under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, perhaps the most left leadership the Labour Party has had. The question of drug policy reform was always absent from the political agenda. When we think about the things that are driving drug policy reform in other countries like the United States, we might think about the recent cannabis regulation by the coalition government in Germany that seems to be being proposed. Often the issues that are driving it are issues that would traditionally interest the political left: criminal justice, over-policing, mass incarceration. Why do you think that there is this relative quiet on issues of drug policy reform in the British left?
Well, I think in order to answer that question, first we've got to look at how is prohibitionism doing according to its own standards. So even if we were to accept the current orthodoxy which informs UK drug policy, which is there's no such thing as safe recreational use, drugs are bad, nobody should take them, we just have to look around and see that prohibition has failed to achieve any of these supposed goals. So Scotland, for instance, has got the worst rate of drugs deaths in Europe, and people quite clearly are still taking drugs. So up and down the countries, house parties are still terrorized by men hijacking the aux cord because they want to play some GABA, right? We don't live in a drug-free society, even though we live in an intensely prohibitionist one. And prohibition is very plainly failed to stop people from taking drugs. So then I think the subsequent question is what prohibitionist drug policy, what is it doing if it's not stopping people from taking drugs? What are the other functions that it serves as a technology of governance? Because I think that question is where we start to discern some of the reasons why there's been an absence of the left in drug policy space. And I think that particularly for the left, what psychoactive substances have done in political culture for centuries serve as a dividing line between the deserving and the undeserving poor. So this has got a much longer history than, what we would call the war on drugs. I think that you have to look at the sort of Victorian and Edwardian moral panics about opium dens, and even older ones about, in the 18th century, about gin palaces. So, the gin palace was seen as a sort of den of iniquity, particularly a corrupting force for working class mothers. And there were these, you can see the kind of like originating coordinates of some of the later moral panics of the 1980s and 1990s of crack mothers and crack babies with gin mothers and gin babies. So there was this like really notorious case of a woman called Judith Defoe, who in 1734 was executed. She was hanged for the murder of her infant child, and it was said that she did it while completely gin addled, and then the next thing she did was, you know, buy a quart of gin after selling her coat and her stockings. So I think that the thing you've got to look at is that dividing line between deserving and undeserving, decent working class and underclass, decent British white working class, and you know, kind of nefarious drug peddling immigrants, to see why the left has been unable to disturb its own attachment to these sort of frameworks of who deserves to be part of, you know, a workerist coalition, right? And workerism, I think, is really key here, because again, you go back to the moral panic about gin palaces. It was this idea that, you know, you had to fear and clamp down on them, because if the working classes were all in gin palaces, then they weren't working. So I think that it has this relationship to workerism, which the left hasn't kind of fully divested itself of. And I suppose on that, the thing that I wanted to ask you is, why have drugs been so deeply entwined with what we think of as the decent working class? Like, how do ideas of decency and propriety shape our attitudes towards drugs and the people who take them?
Absolutely. I think that point that you make about the deserving and undeserving poor, and that attempt to try and draw that demarcation line between who can be the agents of political change, political revolution, the idealized proletariat, and who are seen as, you know, the kind of the unfunctional, subhuman kind of lumpen proletariat in kind of classic Marxist terms. I think that really does divide along this idea of who is able to engage in this kind of Weberian, rationalist, kind of Protestant work ethic that continues to connect with people across the political spectrum. And I think that the idea of drugs has always been seen as something that's decadent, something that in the English tradition is also seen as relatively bourgeois as well. We've got to remember that when we think about the initial engagement of substances that are now prohibited in England within the kind of body politic, we're thinking about the use of opium in the 17th and 18th century. We're thinking about Thomas de Quincey. We're thinking about Samuel Coleridge. We're thinking about, in addition to the scares around gin, as you mentioned, there were also the scares even around a substance as normalized as coffee nowadays. The idea of coffee houses were seen as where, decadent, bohemian, bourgeois people would gather together and, read ideas about the French Revolution and the overthrow of the monarchy. And so this idea of a kind of decadent bourgeois culture around drug taking, I think, is something that has permeated ideas of laborism within the United Kingdom, as well as the kind of more moral conservative elements of traditional prohibitionism. And I wonder whether we think about how that compares with the way in which a much more familiarly multiracial working class and a much more kind of unorganized working class that is more common in the United States of America has allowed the idea of resisting the policing of drugs as being something that can be embraced by institutions of the left over there in America. I wonder whether if that idea of the kind of deserving poor and undeserving poor is a stark considering the way in which migration is a much deeper story within America, the way in which we know that drug prohibition is very much embedded with ideas of migration, whether we want to think about the way in which cannabis was turned into being discussed as marijuana, primarily so that it could be associated with Mexican migration classes into the United States of America. We can look at, the 1925 New York Times article around the time of marijuana's prohibition, which talks about Mexican crazed by marijuana are running amok with butcher's knives across the states of America. These are headlines that are easily searchable for any of our attendees. The familiarity of having to wrestle with these questions of who is the working class, how does that mix in with migration, how does that wrestle with legacies of multiracialism, is something that I think is perhaps a little bit more familiar to the American left tradition than it is to the British left tradition, which might give us some clues into why it has been more receptive towards understanding how drug policy is used to divide the deserving and undeserving working class, whilst we still seem to be a little bit behind here in the United Kingdom. Would you agree that also, in addition to that kind of workerism and laborism, these ideas around decency, these ideas around propriety, there is also a kind of potentially, I think, a discomfort about the primary reason why a lot of people use recreational substances, which is because they enjoy it. And it's a lot more comfortable for us in the left, I think, to talk about, when we can, and we will, and we do detail how drugs is the number one reason for stop and search. 2/3 of stop and search are done by suspicion of using prohibited drugs. We know that 27% of current prisoners, according to the Ministry of Justice statistics, on remand are in prison because of drug offences. We can talk about, the role of drugs in the school expulsions and across a lot of other things in society, and we can make the argument on that basis. But I think that on the left, we're also really struggled to wrestle with the desire for people to take drugs in the first place, which often has a lot to do with the fact that they enjoy it and it gives them pleasure. Is that something that you see in kind of conversations around drug policy at all? Or
Absolutely.
Do you think
yeah. Like, I mean, I was nodding my head like a little dog in the back of a car, because I was like, yeah, like, you are so right. And I think it's because it's really hard to, within certain, and the left tradition in the UK, and the one which is sort of, most represented within the Labour Party, is very, very disciplinarian, right? It also has deep connections to the temperance movement, to Methodism, a real suspicion of psychoactive substances, and indeed the idea of having fun. And there being a sort of, experimental, playful, hedonistic aspect to, communist or socialist ways of thinking. It hasn't been, I think, so well represented within the UK tradition, not in the same way as you see in France or perhaps Italy and parts of the United States as well. So I think that is, particular to the development of Labour and the Labour Party here in the UK. I also think, and this is coming back to how we view the pleasure of recreational drug use as itself an evil, is that it's something which is being reinforced, not just when we are having the conversation about drugs head on, but really, I think, when we're talking about anything to do with various forms of what you might call psychoactive or cognitive impairment. And as a woman, this is something which I think about all the time, which is, the good versus the bad sexual assault victim. All right. If you want to be a good sexual assault victim, your assailant really had better be a stranger, right? Because of course, if it's someone who you're in an intimate partner relationship with, or, perhaps indeed someone in your own family, that doesn't count. And if they are a stranger, you then also have to, jump through certain hoops of worthiness. And it's astonishing to me that we can only make room for discussions about the role of alcohol or drug taking when it comes to sexual assault, if and only if the victim has been spiked. All right. And there's been this recent moral panic, which I think has, really stretched the bounds of credulity about the idea that someone's going around clubs spiking women, not by putting something in their drink, which is obviously fairly easy to do without being caught, but by getting in close enough proximity to do a CIA style injection. Because you think about it for a second, all right? If I'm out there looking to be a sexual predator, why would I go for the method which is most likely to get me caught? But I think that what this speaks to are really deep anxieties about, one, the sort of porousness of the female body. All right, like we are vulnerable to not only sexual violation, but violation of the body politic by whose babies we carry or who it is that we have sex with. And this idea that to be the worthy victim, you can't have done something which I think most people do, which is go out and want to have fun, right? When you have these accounts of spiking, you often hear, and I'm not saying that this isn't true, by the way, but I'm saying that it's telling how amplified this narrative is. You often hear women say, but I only had one drink, or I couldn't have been drunk because I was on antibiotics. I've never taken drugs in my life, so I knew that it was this. What if you're the person who did get drunk? Or what if you're the person who consented to take a recreational psychoactive substance, that's something that you wanted to do? Well, then suddenly you're excluded from this category of being the good victim. And I think that this idea of, in order for your suffering to have meaning, you have to have rigidly avoided pleasure, right? The dangers of pleasure, the kind of corrupting, softening, decadence of pleasure, in order for your suffering to be, politically worthy, I think is something which is very deep within left-wing thinking about this stuff. So I think it's not just about, it's bourgeois. I think it's also you're less worthy a victim. Absolutely. You can't be suffering that much if you want to have fun.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the idea of you brought it on yourself. That the kind of the blame culture that not only surrounds sexual violence that women suffer, but also, like you say, surrounds the idea of the breakdown of the community body politic. I think that idea of the porousness of women's bodies and the way that drugs kind of play into that, and a lot of that driving the anxiety and fear around drugs is something that we can really see when we go right back to the very start of prohibition, in terms of the way in which prohibition came into its kind of modern form was really driven. We talk a lot about the demonization of racial minorities, which of course, the headlines make that very clear. But we also don't talk, I think, enough about the way in which a lot of that anxiety was framed around a protection of whiteness. And so here, I point people to the American Narcotics Commissioner, Hamilton Wright, who has been described as the father of American narcotics law by scholars. I'd recommend for people to listen to his speech to the U.S. Congress in 1914, which really brings the Harrison Act into being, where large parts of it talk not about the kind of the impact that drugs have upon racial minorities and how it makes them violent and more dangerous, but the impact that it has across white women. And the way that he talks about the dangers of these California opium dens, where these white women are entering into these opium dens and are being seduced and defiled and taken away from the kind of moral Christian upbringing that they were raised in, and that this is something that fuels the panic. And we can see this in a lot of those newspapers in California around that same time, as well as in this speech in the very US Congress, this anxiety around the porousness of white bodies and the way in which particular psychoactive substances either increase or loosen ideas around sexuality, promiscuity, and desire. I think this is something that people are really kind of uncomfortable with. And a century later, we still see that in conversations around drug prohibition, that this is the reason why we need to prohibit drugs, because certain people, if they take drugs, certain bodies, if they take drugs, cannot be trusted with that kind of intoxicant.
It's so interesting listening to you talk about that within an American context, because I was listening to this podcast and the host said something which stuck with me ever since, which is that there is only one moral panic, but 1,000 doors into it. And so we see, some of those doors within a UK context immediately following World War I. So World War I in the UK is when you have drugs prohibition policy being brought in as an emergency measure at first. And that's because you've got a nation at war, and then you have all these anxieties about the corrupting influence of immigrant communities within. And this becomes a sort of door onto the moral panic of the sort of strength and resilience of the nation, corrupting forces from within, and women being the kind of root of that corruption. And you had, because I was looking through sort of I'm interested in the mediatization of some of this stuff. Like I've got an interest in how deranged media can be throughout history. And there were two really striking cases. One was a couple of years after the drug prohibition law was brought in, and so I think this was 1922. And there was a young dancer called Frida Kempton, who was a white woman, and she died of a cocaine overdose. And then the media constructed this whole xenophobic backlash around this one overdose. And so the story went that, you know, she had been seduced and corrupted by a Chinese businessman who was known as Brilliant Chang. She'd been with him the night that she died. And then what this then justified was this, you know, huge outpouring of hatred towards the Chinese community. You know, a little bit earlier than that, you had another famous case of an actress called Billie Carlton. They're still not sure if she died of a cocaine overdose or actually perfectly legal antidepressants. She died in 1918. And as the sort of scandal of this blew up in the press, you had two things happening. One was her friend called Reggie Devoy, who was involved in a blackmail scandal. Someone tried to blackmail him, accusing him of being gay, and he'd also been known to cross-dress. So he became the kind of fall guy, this like sordid sexual deviant who was to blame for supplying this kind of waif-like innocent young actress with cocaine. And then the other thing was a white woman, a white Scottish woman, who was accused of supplying opium to this actress, was arrested and charged and convicted. And what was striking about the Scottish woman is that she'd married a Chinese man. So there are all of these sort of, you know, webs and connections of various forms of, you know, sexual deviance, you know, homophobia, and also like a very intense xenophobia. So when you have, I think, you know, a white woman who then, regardless of who she actually was, I mean, Billie Carlton was not a waif-like, you know, virginal innocent. That's not who she was. But because she was white, she was able to be presented in this way. And so the corruption had to be from a connection to, you know, Chinese immigrants or to, you know, decadent sexual deviance over there. And that's how it played out in the media in some of those, you know, fairly early years in drug prohibition. I'm not sure if that's something which has also come up in your research, which is you have specific figureheads.
I mean, I think that what's most fascinating is, like you say, the kind of the way in which the deranged media sensationalization of stories that surround drug use and death from dangerous drugs or drug addiction have been almost relatively consistent for the past century and are reproducing themselves in different forms. You know, I think that, you know, there are these stories that we can see. You know, I remember when the Michael Brown shooting happened, the way in which his toxicology report was mediatized and presented and sensationalized, how carried immediate echoes of the, you know, the kind of famous Southern Negroes cocaine pandemic headline that was in the New York Times in 1914 as well. You know, the way in which the you know, that story ends with the justification of police violence on this Black individual who's apparently robbing a store due to his kind of violence and superhuman strength, and the fact that he was able to be almost impervious to the initial bullets that were shot. That justifies the eventual action the police have to take in taking his life. And we saw the exact same thing in the way that, you know, Michael Brown's toxicology report was wielded, not only in the case which the officer was acquitted for, but in the actual media justification for his death, a century apart, very similar tropes, very similar ideas. And one thing that kind of brought to me when you were talking is thinking about, well, then what do we say about the kind of role? Because despite the kind of prohibition, despite the kind of you know, the just say no ideology around drugs that was, you know, really kind of really accelerated during the kind of Thatcher years, there was also simultaneously the kind of coke-taking yuppie imagery of you know, kind of elite British society that was also popularized in that era. We've always had this kind of tradition of drug experimentation and kind of decadence, drug taking decadence, as being part of the experience of elite British societies, of elite boarding schools, of the Conservative Party. At the last Conservative leadership campaign, which was also for the Prime Minister, I think there was 100% of at least the final 5 applicants. I think it was about 100% total of all of them coming out with stories of explicitly talking about drug use, whether that's Michael Gove and his, cocaine taking days as a journalist, and who's your man who's smoking the opium pipe, Rory Stewart. In the mountains of Afghanistan, I believe. I don't know where you find an opium pipe. He obviously knows better than me. But this idea that almost in opposition to the bodies that cannot deal with these psychoactive substances, the supposedly virginal woman body that can be induced into licentiousness if they take these substances, the supposedly submissive racial inferior bodies which can be induced into violence and defiance if they take these substances, that there are these particular bodies that have the level of refinement, that have the kind of the perspective to be able to experiment with these substances and to open their mind to deeper artistic and literary truths. Why do you think that has emerged and been so comfortable for particular elite conservative politicians to be able to talk about their own drug experimentation when they were younger, but at the same time, now they're in office, recommend this kind of draconian prohibition for the majority of the public?
We may not have an industrial base like we used to, but this country still makes something better than anybody else, and that is political hypocrisy. And I'm very proud of that. It astonished me that when you had that Conservative leadership race and then effectively a prime ministerial one, you had all of these politicians who every step of the way had voted for harsher criminalization and penalties for drug possession, falling over themselves to say, I smoked the marijuana and did, in fact, inhale. You had Andrea Leadsome's claiming that she had smoked weed at university, and quite frankly, I didn't believe her. I went, of all the people admitting that you've taken drugs, I don't think you did. I just think that you've recognized that, within this context, it made you look like you were worldly, experienced, that you had some kind of, little tickle of the underbelly at some point, some kind of creative experimental impulse at one point. And that's why I personally think she fibbed when she said that she'd smoked weed. She's never been near a joint in her life. And I think that what this points to is the much deeper cultural hypocrisy that we have around drug taking, right? We don't have one single coherent cultural viewpoint of drugs. On the one hand, you have, very intense, not just prohibitionism in policy, but a disciplinarian impulse in British culture. I've got a theory that you could get any activity, you could describe any activity, even if it's really loved by the British, like football or, I don't know, curtain twitching. And with enough of a media campaign, you could get 50+% of Brits to say, I would want to ban it. All right. Mm-hmm. I think that there is something which is deeply suspicious about the idea of people having fun, of being unruly, of being too noisy, of being disruptive, of heaven forbid, not queuing. And I think that you've got that one aspect of British culture. And then on the other hand, you've got an awareness that if you didn't have psychoactive substances, you would have nothing interesting in popular culture. You wouldn't have the kind of, psychedelic edge of folk traditions, which form the kind of core of the baby boomer id, right? So it doesn't matter that you spent your whole life working in insurance, you now own 2 properties. You still think, I was once that weed smoking radical, listening to Bob Dylan. I remember when he went electric. You certainly wouldn't have anything interesting about club culture. You wouldn't have had the second summer of love. You wouldn't have had, the stuff that we think about as working class club culture as well, of rave and, the hacienda and stuff like that. And even if you want to take it away from anything that could be described as counterculture and just look at, you know, the beating commercial heart of popular culture, I was watching The Weeknd's halftime show at the Super Bowl. It's very disappointing, by the way, that not all American football matches have Beyonce in the middle. I thought was really disappointing. But I was watching The Weeknd, and you know, he's doing his like biggest song, or two of his biggest songs are just all about like taking loads of coke and being off your face, right? Like, I can't feel my face, blinded by the lights. You know, these are songs which, like, you know, 2-3-year-olds are singing because it's got that like catchy pop hook which like is designed for the brain of a toddler. And so you've got the centrality of drugs, and it's right there staring you in the face, and there's a level of acceptability. Whereas if you were to say, I've taken cocaine, or I've taken pills, and unlike Michael Gove, I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and pretend that it's the thing that I regret most in my life. No, I had a great time. You know, that's beyond the pale. And I think that the left has not tried to take on that hypocrisy. And I think that there's something cowardly about that. Whereas the thing that we should be saying is, look, prohibitionism has failed. People are still taking drugs. People are still taking drugs in ways which are really unsafe. Addiction is being punished through the criminal justice system. And I think we should also talk about the different ways different drug use is criminalized. The criminalization of crack addiction in the 80s and 90s for Black mothers, I think, is really important here. So you still have all the really bad stuff about problematic use of drugs. And we also, at the same time, celebrate it at every turn. So what's going on here? You know, I don't think you have pop culture without hedonism. I wouldn't want to have pop culture without hedonism. Can you imagine it?
I mean, it'd be horrific. It'd be just Coldplay on repeat forever. But I think that, you know, I think that one thing that is really, and I'll make this probably the last question before we then open it up to the audience. I think one thing that we wanted to kind of really wrestle with is then having a look towards the future. I think it's been really helpful to kind of cover some of the history, some of the deep stories that inform the kind of prevalent ideas around drug use and in the media in Britain, as well as the actual policy and the laws that govern drug prohibition in this country. But I think that something that is really, for me, really, really crucial is that it does feel that we are in a moment of global shift around these ideas. In terms of cannabis, we're seeing now a hyper commercialized legal recreational market being created, not just in North America and Canada and many states in the United States of America. Federal legislation is now, there's a competition between the Republicans and the Democrats. Both have introduced federal legislation bills, and they're going to see which one can get through Congress and the Senate quicker. Whilst over here in the UK, we have, Priti Patel and Keir Starmer competing for who can best kind of play act Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. So we've got a completely different situation in North America, but we also have the creation of recreational cannabis markets in Luxembourg and Europe, seemingly in Germany very shortly. We have full-scale decriminalization in Portugal. We have, legal markets, South Africa, Mexico. So it does seem like we're in a moment of change. And this is not just talking about cannabis. We can look at that full-scale decriminalization of all drugs in places like Portugal, also in Oregon, in the United States of America. And what I wanted to kind of stop and think about is, if we don't wrestle with a lot of the questions that we've mentioned today, if we don't talk about the way in which ideas around drugs intersect with ideas of propriety and decency that are also tied to particular ideas around what gendered bodies and racialized bodies should be doing in a healthy, productive society, do we run the danger, do you think, of perhaps reproducing some of those inequalities and some of those injustices in a new legalized, hyper-commercialized market around drug taking? In short, can we create a world where those ideas around the people who are able to experiment with drugs and who are able to be trusted with drugs can engage in the legal practice, but that can only be justified through the increased prohibition and policing and disciplining of individuals who are still seen as as too risky to be able to engage in these particular substances. How do you see the future panning out if we are in this moment of shift?
I mean, look, venture capital is already ready for full-scale weed decriminalization, at least in this country. So you've got the husbands of conservative MPs who are, you know, part of hedge funds who are investing very heavily in medicinal cannabis use, and also, you know, investing in the United States in terms of recreational cannabis use as well. All the while, you know, his wife, Victoria Atkins, I think her name is, still saying absolutely no decriminalization of cannabis whatsoever. So, you know, capital moves faster than politics a lot of the time, because politics is having to deal with the cultural baggage, the hearts and minds stuff. And that's why, you know, as you said, you've got the absurd spectacle of, you know, the ghoulish Priti Patel and, you know, Alan Partridge impersonator Keir Starmer crowing about the evils of weed. You know, it's frankly silly. I think that in terms of what you know, we talk about just transitions with relation to climate change, and I think just transitions with regards to decriminalization of psychoactive substances apply as well, because there are plenty of commodities which are legal where the violence within the supply chain is absolutely brutal. You know, I'm not just talking about oil, gold, and rare earth minerals, but things like imported prawns, which are the product of slave labor, you know, the tomatoes which we get from Spain and from Italy.
Yeah.
So I don't think that legalization is, you know, this one crazy trick to dealing with violence and exploitation. I think that it can deal with a lot of that stuff domestically, but in terms of, you know, where in, you know, the hinterland of the global south, you know, the product is being manufactured, I think that it's perfectly plausible that the violence doesn't really change there. So then this is why I you know, not to like blow smoke up your ass, Kojo, but why your book with Oscar was so important, The War on Drugs and the Global Color Line, is that it does look at how you have to contextualize any move towards decriminalization and legalization within wider demands for global justice. Because one of the things that the war on drugs, you know, wasn't simply disciplining racialized bodies in the global north. The war on drugs was also an excuse for the forces of, you know, neoliberal capital, the American empire, to come into South American countries and rewrite the entire constitution, you know, to funnel land and resources into the hands of landowning oligarchs, to dispossess indigenous peoples. These things were done, sure, in by, you know, drug cartels, but also done in the interest of fighting those same drug cartels. So I think that that's the thing that we need to be wary of, which is presenting decriminalization and legalization as the only thing that you've got to do. Actually, the terrain of conflict is much broader and much more complex than some people, I think, within, you know, decriminalize the wave, give it credit for.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that that level of complexity is something that is not only urgent for us to wrestle with, but is also the reason why I think it's so essential that kind of left movements that are concerned with issues around migration, concerned with issues around environmental justice, concerned with issues around economic or racial justice, are recognizing that this is some of the battleground of the future when we're talking about drug policy. You know, when we're thinking about, you know, the recent discussions around climate change and thinking about the impact of aerial fumigation policies in the Cali region of Colombia, or when we think about the impact of crop eradication policies in, you know, Afghanistan, or in so many other places where they face the kind of the harsh end of the international war on drugs. The environmental impact of that has been devastating, but we also recognize that in a, you know, in a hyper commercialized, hyper lucrative legal recreational market, the kind of use and exploitation of those areas in order to create huge amounts of lucrative commodities for you know, Western based cannabis corporations. You know, we can think about how so many of the tobacco companies are already moving into the legal cannabis space. Philip Morris, many of them, registering their own cannabis brands. The history of crop production in the global South isn't one that creates confidence in yourself in terms of what might be the sustainable development aspects of their entrance into those cannabis markets. I think that we need to start trying to make those connections across different parts of the kind of left political platform in order to not allow a kind of new era of drug commodity exchange across the world to simply reproduce and perhaps even accelerate some of those harms of the previous war on drugs prohibition era. Excellent. So with that, I will bring a close to the conversation that me and Ash have had directly, but I'm sure that there's been a lot of questions either that have been mentioned already, or I would invite you who've been listening to throw in your questions here, and then we will try and respond to them. So I'm just going to have a look at some questions here. I've got one here, which is, what are you, as you mentioned right at the start, Scotland now having the record death from dangerous drugs in Europe. We've got a question here from Colleen about what are your thoughts on the situation in Scotland? So here I'm sure Colleen's talking about the kind of de facto decriminalization that's been introduced in Scotland. And do you think that they will be able to make serious changes to their drug policy? We've already seen some of the backlash from Westminster, and of course this is going to be tied into the much broader question around Scottish independence and Scottish devolution. But do you think there's any hope in the way that there has been seemingly a bit of a political change in Scotland around the policing of drugs?
I mean, I think it's one which has been driven by necessity, the same way the violence reduction policies in Glasgow around knife crime were a shift away from, lock them up, long sentences. And it was, again, just driven by the fact that people were suffering too much to be able to continue with the flawed policy. In terms of the kinds of levels of rates of drug deaths that you see in Scotland, as well as associated healthcare outcomes in terms of things like, HIV, associated, child protection referrals, all this kind of stuff, dealing with it purely through the lens of drug policy clearly won't be enough. This is the result of deindustrialization, of austerity, of prosperity, of funding and support and purpose just being ripped out of communities wholesale. So unless you start thinking about, and I think quite a serious way, how you return prosperity, support, opportunity to the affected areas, you're only going to be sort of dealing with one tiny aspect of what caused the kind of outrageous figures that we're seeing. And I know we didn't quite get time to discuss this. It does make me think about, the crack epidemic of the 80s and the 90s, particularly with regards to children. There was a big moral panic about the time that, infants who were born to mothers who had used crack during their pregnancy would not only experience symptoms of like fetal withdrawal or it might be born prematurely, but that these would affect them for the rest of their lives. Now, the best available studies we have showed that that didn't happen. Instead, what you saw was that regardless of whether the child had been born to a mother who had taken crack cocaine during her pregnancy or not, they were still scoring lower on every single measure than children who'd been born into more affluent and, stable and less police backgrounds, because 81% of these kids had seen someone arrested, 74% heard gunshots, 35% had seen someone get shot, nearly a fifth had seen a dead body outside, and these kids were only 7 years old, right, at that point. So coming back to Scotland, unless you're dealing with all the kinds of deprivation, the children of many of these adults who are experiencing problems with addiction, unless you deal with problems of housing, problems of violence, problems of a lack of support services, problems of lack of healthcare access, you might even, deal with addiction in a much better way, might even, significantly reduce the problem of problematic use. But you're probably not going to have a huge impact on these kids and their life chances if the poverty and the deprivation remains the same. But what do you think, Kojo? Sorry, I rambled for a long time.
I think that's a great connection when you think about that idea of the much broader context that has fueled the kind of alienation and isolation that has driven problematic drug use within somewhere like Scotland, which has led to the statistics in terms of dangerous drug deaths, in terms of questions around infectious diseases and a lot of the other negative consequences that they're wrestling with at the moment. I think that connection between the kind of ideas around crack mothers and the kind of crack epidemic of America in the 80s and the situation we find in Scotland, that connection can be made through a single organization. And I'm sure probably a lot of people listening will be familiar with Barbara Harris's Project Prevention, which started off in the United States, which was an organization that was driven to pay young women who were considered to be drug addicted to be essentially sterilized. And now she's of course moved that over to Scotland. Over the past few years, she was in Glasgow paying them £200 for essential sterilization, with this idea that that's the only way that you can avoid this consequence of a plethora of what Keith Joseph in the 80s would have said as kind of delinquent children. So this idea is definitely something that has been resonated in different models, but I think that having a kind of health-focused approach to drug policy is one step towards that, which we seem to be moving towards in Scotland. But there's many other factors that are going to be required in order to try and put the heart back into those communities that have been devastated over the period of neoliberalism. I'm thinking another question here, which is brings us, I think, really into some of the cutting edge discussions on the left at the moment around abolitionism, both of prisons and policing. This is a question here from Juan Fernandez Ocha, who says that considering that the police is an institutionally racist institution, is there any role for them in a post-prohibitionist future? Here we might be thinking a lot about how much of police work is actually driven by the policing of the war on drugs. I mentioned a little bit about the stop and search statistics, how much that's been a justification for ever expanding police forces over the last 30 or 40 years in the US and the UK. What do you think of this relationship between debates around police abolitionism or prison abolitionism even, and this idea of actually moving away from a prohibitionist drug policy?
I mean, I think that there's a very obvious connection between abolitionism and moving away from prohibitionist drugs policy, because we've treated for decades now problematic use as criminal justice issue. Do you think putting someone in prison stops them from taking drugs? No, like it's more likely to turn somebody into an addict, somebody who has got a really problematic relationship with psychoactive substances. In terms of is there a role for the police in this kind of in this post-prohibitionist future? I think one of the things we need to recognize in this country is that we haven't necessarily seen the huge inflation of police budgets relative to other public services, the same way in the United States, where, the LAPD have a tank. But what you have seen is, regardless of what the budget allocation is like for the police force from government to government, you have a tendency towards shuttling more and more powers over to the police, and powers and areas of intervention which used to belong to other services. So right around the time you have, the decline of psychiatric nurses in the community, what do you have? You've got, Margaret Thatcher bringing in reforms, which gives police officers the power to section somebody under the Mental Health Act. So you've got this big shift of treating mental health issues as a healthcare issue, to a policing issue. Ditto, you've got that same story when it comes to things like child protection, social work, intervening in the lives of very vulnerable people, only when they can be considered criminally disruptive and not at earlier stages of their need. So for me, rather than going, how do we imagine the role of police in a post-prohibitionist future. For me, the more productive question is, how do you imagine the role of literally everybody else? Because the police have had an outsized role for too long, and it hasn't dealt with any of these social issues adequately. But I don't know, what do you reckon, Kojo?
No, absolutely. I think that's a really cool point when you think about, you know, this idea of trying to address some of these social issues that we've constantly used the policing for. Are really like the kind of the recent description that's been given by the abolitionist Decriminalization, who's mentioned about we've used the police almost like a bucket in a leaking house, and though we've continued to just add more and more buckets as more and more social issues we think can be resolved by placing a bucket underneath that leak, when if you actually remove the bucket, that gives you the idea of thinking about, well, what can we do to actually reduce this level of harm? Can we bring in expanded and different ideas around mental health support? Can we bring in different ideas around youth engagement and community support? What are we doing with those youth services and those early intervention programs that have been cut throughout austerity and only been cut further over the last 10 years? This is something that I think is really essential. And in terms of the changing of policing that could come with the changing of drug policy, I think that whilst we don't have the kind of expansion of policing numbers over here in the UK, I think the one thing that we do have is the police do have a lot of powers in terms of intervention, in terms of confrontation of people, which will remove this idea of this kind of perpetual policing that the drug war facilitates, this idea that there's a potential constant suspicion that you can place on people, suspicion of carrying drugs on you, suspicion of dealing drugs. That all of a sudden starts to reframe the role of police in society. And I think that's a conversation that is long overdue. So yeah, I think that's a really good question and something that we need to be thinking about as we start to, I think, across society more broadly reckon with ideas of abolitionism in a more serious way than they have been, at least in the pre-George Floyd era. I'm just going to get a couple more questions now I think we've got time for, which me and Ash will try and respond to as well. So we've got this one question from Ruth here, which says, how can we prepare young people to move safely through a world in which prohibition is the policy? I think here, thinking about what we mentioned at the start of this conversation, that a lot of people will take drugs. You know what I mean? A lot of people want to take drugs. A lot of people enjoy taking drugs. There's the anthropologists Ross Coomer and Nigel South, who've looked at a plethora of human societies through time immemorial, and they've been unable to find a single human society that didn't have some form of either recreational, ritualistic, or spiritual intoxication. And so this is something that's probably your young person, I'm sorry to tell you, is more likely to do than not. How do you prepare them to move through that world where at the moment taking drugs or being poor with drugs can still end up in not just entrance into the criminal justice system, and we know that happens a lot more with particular young people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, but also can lead to people being expelled from school, expelled from university, really damage their life chances, damage their ability to travel outside of the country in which the jurisdiction in which they were born. How do we prepare young people, or what kind of things do you think we should speak to young people about prohibition as a policy?
I want to hear from you, Coach, because you've obviously got a gorgeous little one, my favorite niece. So as a parent, not just as somebody who's interested in this from, an academic and an activist and a politics angle, but as a parent, how are you preparing her to deal with the realities of recreational drug use in a prohibitionist context?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I've been thinking about and talking about. At the moment, my little one is only 3, so I haven't yet been preparing her. I know they party quite hard at her nursery, but I don't think we're yet trying recreational stuff. But in terms of thinking about it as the future, I think it's a lot of those issues which will be made a lot easier in a post-prohibitionist future. So when we think about kind of safe use of drugs, when we think about the idea of taking drugs in a community of friends who you feel trusting and comforted with, and we think about the idea of how different substances interact with each other. We think about the idea of we do get dangerous batches of substances that we start to be distributed around an area, and being aware and being insightful of that. I think that these are some of the kind of conversations that I anticipate having when she starts getting to that age where she is out in the world and enjoying herself, and having her own social life, an awareness of, particular life-saving drugs, things like naloxone, and how those can help people who are really in acute situations around, in terms of overdose of use. So I think these are some of the things that you have to speak to them about their own use. But then I think in terms of preparing them for the realities of what the impact of prohibition can have across young people, I think you do then have to talk about, what are the consequences of entering into the criminal justice system? What are the consequences of, some of the impact that can have on your life? Not in a don't do this and this is what will happen to you if you do this kind of scare story that I know that I was very much raised with. My mom, being a traditional West African immigrant mom, was not about, let's look at the complexity and nuance of this. It was just, if you do this, I will kill you. And then now I spend all my time talking about and reading drugs, so you can judge for yourselves how successful that's been. But not speaking about it in those ways, but also making them aware that the impact of over policing on particular minority communities, the impact of things like Notting Hill Carnival, and the fact that every time you go to Notting Hill Carnival, there is going to be a Section 60 in place, and the Section 60 will allow police to stop and search people without having any grounds of suspicion. So just be aware of how you're moving into and out of that space where you're going to be essentially a target for something that could have life-changing consequences. I think that's, some of the more difficult conversations that I anticipate having as a parent as I grow older. Definitely. And then I think we're just going to go with one final question here, which I think touches on a lot of the different topics that we've been mentioning. And this is a question from Daniel, who says, is the shift to treating addiction as a health rather than criminal issue helpful? Do we think that health interventions can retain the spirit of control and punishment? Is it simply health and criminalization, or are there other things that we need to be drawing upon and thinking about when we talk about drug use and drug policy?
I think this is such a perceptive question, because I think that there is something in this, right, which is health just becomes the alternative disciplining tool. So that is actually what's going on in Portugal. All right, it's not really a kind of recreational hedonistic free-for-all. What it sort of does is driving people down a healthcare pathway with a threat of, severe curtailments of your freedom if you don't do it. So there are healthcare models of harm reduction which work hand in hand with the criminal justice system and don't really deal with, I think, some of those underlying problems that we're talking about. So I think that a health discussion when it comes to addiction and problematic use is definitely important. I don't think that we get anywhere by pretending that everybody has a really fun and carefree experience of drugs. Most people who take drugs do, right? That is the fact. But it's like saying we want to have a conversation about driving which doesn't include the possibility of car crashes, right? That's silly. So I do think that we've got to take the health angle seriously, but that's why it's also important when we're talking about the potential for healthcare to be a disciplining tool, is that we're also thinking about the way in which drugs policy has served as a pretext to criminalize certain kinds of people. So even if you are taking away the criminalizing aspect, but you're still going in with social services interventions which deem somebody, through the rubric of healthcare, a danger to themselves and others, and it results in their kids being taken away and put through the care system, kind of intergenerational family breakdown and trauma, well, we'd go, this isn't what we had in mind. So I think that you've got to put the purpose of drugs policy and its disciplinary intentions like at the forefront of any demand of a shift towards healthcare, right? The care part has got to be front and center. And I also think that that's where the conversations that we're having about safe recreational use, what that looks like, the aspects of pleasure, experimentation, exploration, that I think becomes an important counterweight to a kind of very po-faced, like, drugs are bad, but they should be dealt with by hospitals and not jail, right? You start complicating the moral content. But yeah, what do you reckon?
I mean, I would fully agree, and I'm sure for a lot of people it might be frustrating because I've just agreed with everything that Ash has said throughout a lot of this conversation, but it is, really articulating and touching on the key points. I think it's very easy to simply say, I'm going to continue to problematize drug use, but I'm just going to problematize it as a health issue rather than problematize it as a criminal issue. And that does a real disservice to, like we mentioned, and we've talked about over the entire course of this conversation, the primary reason why a lot of people might engage with particular types of substance use. It also has the danger of simply reinforcing those class, racial, and gender inequalities around which bodies are able to engage in that more experimental, that more hedonistic, that more decadent and celebratory element of psychoactive substance use, and those who are going to find it problematic by default of their racial or ethnic or gendered identity. This idea that particular people, it will lead to mental health issues, it will inevitably lead to addiction issues, it will lead to dangerous use. And this can be used as a real disciplinary tool across not just individuals, but across entire whole communities. I don't think that that is the target for people who are currently putting so much energy and so much, excellent drive into reforming the drug laws and to making some of the more horrific aspects of the current kind of prohibitionist policy a thing of the past. And so I think it's there's the kind of the saying about kind of a bad general prepares for the last war, was good general thinks about the next war. I think it's really important for those who are concerned with issues around drug policy and about the damage that they've done over the past war on drugs period to not simply be thinking about the past war, but to be thinking about the future and what's to come, and how we can take what we've learned from the failings of the war on drugs to try and create a better context for society, not just for kind of drug users and drug producers in the world, but for society at large. So with that, I will thank Ash for being in conversation with me today. I'll thank you all for your fantastic questions. Of course, thank the wonderful people at Harm Reduction International and everyone who's worked on the Constellations Conference for giving us the space to have this conversation, and for all of your support during this event. I hope you will enjoy the rest of the festival and all of the other speakers. So many brilliant talks, so many interesting points to be touched upon. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you once again, Ash.
Thank you.